One of the most attractive features of Star Trek, one of the aspects of that particular fictional universe that seems to draw in a lot of the people who are devoted fans of it, is its depiction of a utopian future for humanity. In the world of Star Trek, or at least in the part of it which most Trekkies imagine themselves living in, there is no poverty, there is no inequality. People no longer have to worry about not getting health care or not having housing or not being able to afford food or any of the other challenges that we are used to, one might say too used to, here in the real world. It's paradise. Earth in Star Trek is paradise. It's explicitly called that at times, and the glimpses we get of it seem to back that up. But let me ask you this. If it's such a paradise, and if everything is so great, why are almost all of the heroes we meet in Star Trek officers in the military? Why does service in that military seem like the best job? Is that a sign of a healthy society, do you think? I'm talking about Starfleet, of course, and in even characterizing Starfleet as a military, I'm taking a somewhat controversial position. Controversial because it directly contradicts the way the franchise itself characterizes Starfleet. None of you should give a shit about my view of Starfleet contradicting the official view of the franchise, but if you're a fellow Trekkie, and I assume most of you are, maybe you are interested in the contradiction between what the Star Trek franchise has told us about Starfleet and what it has shown us about it. I want to examine that contradiction and talk about how I wish the creators of the franchise would make more dramatic and thematic use of it. And I want to do that by asking and answering one simple question. Is Starfleet actually a military? When Gene Roddenberry created Starfleet, which wasn't actually called Starfleet on screen until midway through the first season of the original Star Trek series, because a lot of this stuff that we take for granted now was being made up as they went along at the time. But anyway, he modeled it roughly after the United States Navy. Roddenberry himself had served in the U.S. Army Air Corps during World War II. His assistant director and producer on Star Trek, Bob Justman, had served in the Navy, and Gene Coon, one of the most influential writers and producers on the original series, had served in the Marine Corps. With so many of the show's most prominent creators having military experience, it makes sense that the organization in which the heroes of the series served would have a decidedly military character. But despite the military experience of many of those involved in the making of Star Trek, and despite Roddenberry himself acknowledging the inspirational role played by the U.S. Navy specifically, Roddenberry always insisted that Starfleet was not a military. One of the most consistent objections Roddenberry had to the Star Trek feature films produced under the leadership of Harve Bennett was that their portrayal of Starfleet was too militaristic. When Roddenberry himself took back a measure of control over the franchise by creating Star Trek The Next Generation, he determined to downplay the similarities with real-life militaries and present Starfleet as a peaceful organization dedicated to exploration, science, and diplomacy. If we take Roddenberry's view that Starfleet isn't a military, then what is it? One popular position is that Starfleet is meant to be a descendant of government space programs like NASA, the ESA, JAXA, and others. I like that idea. Astronauts are my heroes, and I always enjoy it when Star Trek tells its stories in ways that evoke real-life human space exploration when they do astronaut shit. And there are occasional parallels between Starfleet and real-world space programs, particularly NASA. The Starfleet uniforms in Star Trek Enterprise are reminiscent of flight suits worn by actual astronauts and even include mission patches on the arms. However, the similarities with NASA are relatively few, and there are far more differences between NASA and Starfleet that we see on screen. One of the most obvious differences is in how the two organizations are structured. NASA astronauts don't have military-style ranks. There is consideration given to their particular skill sets and levels of experience when selecting astronauts for missions, but an astronaut doesn't hold a rank like captain or commander or lieutenant. NASA astronauts do operate within command structures. But those exist only within the confines of a particular mission, and the positions within that structure differ from program to program. For example, on Apollo flights, there was a commander, a command module pilot, and a lunar module pilot. On the space shuttle, which typically flew with a much larger crew, there was a commander, a pilot, a payload commander, a flight engineer, mission specialists, payload specialists, and sometimes other jobs as well. In the currently ongoing Artemis program, the crew consists of a commander, a pilot, and 2 mission specialists. These are all positions astronauts are assigned on particular missions, not ranks. If I wanted to make a case that Starfleet is not a military, the closest real-world analog I can think of is a uniformed service. Militaries are uniformed services, but not all uniformed services are militaries. Here in the United States, we have 2 uniformed services that operate under the authority of the federal government that are not part of our armed forces: the Public Health Service Commissioned Corps and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Commissioned Officer Corps. They both have uniforms, ranks, a hierarchical command structure, features we naturally associate with militaries, but they are not military organizations. Is that what Starfleet is? A non-military uniformed service? You can make a case for that. And, I mean, it's all made up anyway, so if you're really attached to the idea that Starfleet is not a military, you can think whatever you want. Personally, based upon the on-screen depiction of Starfleet over the last 60 years, I think there is a much stronger case to be made that Starfleet is a military. To explain why I think that, I'm going to ask another more fundamental question. What is a military? Most dictionaries will tell you that a military is a nation's armed forces, but that's a bit simplistic for my purpose here, so I put together my own expanded definition. Not so much a definition as a description. If you have any objections to my description, or you think I left anything out once I've gone through it, please let me know in the comments. Full disclosure, I've never served in any military. I have no special knowledge or expertise regarding the military. What I'm talking about in this video is based on my own amateur research, and it's entirely possible I have overlooked or misunderstood something. I mean, hey, there's a first time for everything, right? There are 6 qualities I have identified that an organization needs in order to be considered a military. Let's go through them one at a time and see how many of them apply to Starfleet. First, to be a military, an organization must be sanctioned by a sovereign state. It can have every one of the qualities I'm going to mention after this, but if it's not officially sanctioned by the government of a nation, it's not a military. There's no controversy here regarding Starfleet, though it's not explicitly established at first. Eventually, the creators of Star Trek: The Original Series figured it out, and since then, Starfleet has been clearly and repeatedly identified in every Star Trek series and film as operating under the authority of the United Federation of Planets. That's why the names of Starfleet ships in every series other than Enterprise, which is set prior to the founding of the Federation, all begin with the letters USS. Those stand for United, as in United Federation of Planets, Starship, or sometimes United Spaceship. Again, it depends because the writers were making this shit up as they went along. Also, the real reason the ship names all start with USS is because that prefix is used in real life by the United States Navy, where it stands for United States Ship. And as I already mentioned, Starfleet was patterned after the US Navy. Second, in order to be considered a military, an organization must have uniformed personnel, and those personnel must be organized in a hierarchy with a chain of command. Again, clearly this is the case with Starfleet. The uniforms are goofy, especially on TV. Every day is wear your pajamas to work day. But they are uniforms, and everybody has to wear them. Everybody except for one sexy lady per ship, that is. I know 7 of 9 isn't officially a member of Starfleet at that point, but work with me here. Third, the organization must be divided into separate and distinct branches with clearly defined responsibilities. Here in the United States, our military consists of several branches: the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, and, as of 2019, the Space Force. Starfleet isn't divided into branches in quite that same way, just because of the nature of it. All of its operations are focused on outer space, but it is still organized into specialized divisions and agencies. In the original series, for example, we see the personnel aboard the Enterprise serving across 3 separate divisions. Those wearing gold uniforms are part of the Command Division, those wearing blue are part of the Sciences Division, and those wearing red are there to get killed to establish the seriousness of the threat the other characters are facing. It's an efficient way to organize everyone so there's minimal duplication of effort. As the franchise moves along through the original series and beyond, we see or hear mention of many other divisions, departments, and agencies within Starfleet. There's a Corps of Engineers, there's a Judge Advocate General's office, an Inspector General's office, an Intelligence Department, an Internal Affairs Department, a Temporal Investigations Department. We also see that there is great variation when it comes to the nature of Starfleet missions. Most Starfleet personnel we see in the shows and films are serving aboard starships and are, at least in theory, on exploratory missions, but we also see ships carrying out more specific scientific assignments or which are deployed in more of a defensive capacity. And in addition to the ships, there are star bases, which are dedicated to providing service and recreation facilities for the crews of starships, and which also serve to establish a stable Starfleet presence in a given location. My personal favorite Star Trek series, Deep Space Nine, centers most of its action on a space station where the primary mission, at least initially, isn't exploratory, but political and diplomatic. Fourth, the organization must be governed by special laws and codes created specifically for it. Here in the United States, we have the Uniform Code of Military Justice, a separate section of our law which governs the military. When military personnel are accused of violating the Code of Military Justice, they are tried by a special court called a court-martial. Starfleet has its own collection of laws specifically created to govern it, called the Uniform Code of Justice. Captain Picard cites it in the TNG episode The Drumhead, when he is called to testify at the Inquisition being led by Admiral Satie. He asks to make a statement prior to being questioned, and Satie initially denies his request until Picard comes back with Chapter 4, Article 12 of the Uniform Code of Justice grants me the right to make a statement before questioning begins, motherfucker, and Satie lets him say his piece. The Uniform Code of Justice is also featured in the Strange New Worlds episode Ad Astra per Aspera, when Number 1 faces court-martial for concealing the fact that she was genetically engineered. Number 1's lawyer, Nira Khatul, even uses a printed copy of the Uniform Code of Justice as a prop in her closing argument. We get our first good look at what Starfleet's justice system looks like in an episode of Star Trek the Original Series where Captain Kirk faces a court-martial. What's that episode called? The Trial of James T. Kirk. No, that's a comic book. Oh yeah, court-martial. In the episode, Kirk is brought up on charges after computer records seem to show that he was responsible for the death of an officer under his command, either negligently or willfully. It turns out the officer, Lieutenant Commander Finney, faked his own death and altered the computer records so that Kirk would be blamed for it because he bears a grudge against Kirk and also because he's fucking bonkers. But the plot of the episode isn't super important here. What matters is the picture it paints for us of how things work when a member of Starfleet is accused of wrongdoing while serving in the uniform. That picture looks pretty militaristic to me. Kirk faces a panel of judges consisting of fellow officers. Everyone wears their slightly less pajama-esque dress uniforms. The issue at hand during the trial is whether or not Kirk followed the established protocol during the crisis that led to the apparent death of Finney. And one more thing, it's called a court-martial. Only militaries have those. That's what the martial bit means. Fifth, to be a military, an organization must have armed personnel. This is obviously the case. We see Starfleet personnel packing heat from the very first episode of Star Trek ever broadcast. Over the years, we mostly see security officers carrying phasers, and their duties are more analogous to peacekeeping and law enforcement. They aren't using their arms to attack members of an opposing army, usually. But it's also very apparent that members of Starfleet other than those serving specifically in security roles carry phasers, and that arms training is a standard part of the preparation everyone in Starfleet is required to receive. Not only are Starfleet personnel armed, the ships are pretty heavily armed as well. Every hero ship from every Star Trek TV series or movie has been equipped not only with phasers, but also with torpedoes. In Star Trek the original series, there's an episode, A Taste of Armageddon, where Kirk tells Scotty to prepare to carry out General Order 24. What is General Order 24? Well, it turns out General Order 24 is an order for a starship to destroy all life on an entire planet. Let's not dwell on why a supposedly benevolent organization would have such an order on its books. The point is, if the order exists, then presumably the ship which receives the order carries enough weaponry to implement it. Whatever they call it, that sounds like a warship to me. Sixth, to be a military, an organization must be tasked with providing defense and projecting state power through force. My guess is when most people think of the military, this is the first role they're imagining. This is the most fundamentally, definitively military characteristic of a military. It defends the homeland and it uses force in the interest, or the claimed interest, of the nation which empowers it. Put more simply, the military fights the wars. And while I think each of the previous 5 qualities I've delineated is also important when determining whether or not Starfleet is a military organization, this one to me is the most important and the one that seals the deal and establishes that, yes, Starfleet is, conclusively, a military. It fights the wars. Going back once again to classic Star Trek, where the franchise originated, in the first season we have the episode Errand of Mercy, where the Federation and the Klingon Empire briefly enter a state of war. The fact that, according to the opening narration, the Enterprise's mission is to explore strange new worlds doesn't prevent it from being immediately involved in the war. Kirk and Spock find themselves on an urgent mission to secure a strategically important planet. When trying to persuade the inhabitants of that planet, the Organians, to side with the Federation, Kirk apologizes for his bluntness and describes himself as a soldier, not a diplomat. No wars actually occurred during the run of Star Trek The Next Generation, unless you count the one between the Federation and the Klingons in the temporarily altered timeline of yesterday's Enterprise, but several relatively recent wars are mentioned over the years, most notably the war between the Federation and the Cardassians, which figures into multiple episodes and becomes important backstory for Star Trek Deep Space Nine as well. During Deep Space Nine, there is also mention of a war between the Federation and the Zenkethi. Of course, much of the last few seasons of Deep Space Nine is devoted to a major war between the Federation and the Dominion. When Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Strange New Worlds rolled around more recently, they depicted another war between the Federation and the Klingons. In all of these examples and more, the wars are fought on behalf of the Federation by Starfleet. There is no other organization that the Federation calls upon to fight on its behalf. Starfleet is the armed forces of the Federation. That, for me, settles the argument as to whether Starfleet is a military or a scientific and exploratory agency akin to NASA. When the United States is at war, NASA doesn't do the fighting. The Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, they do the fighting. The Coast Guard keeps the coast, ports, and waterways safe. The Space Force helps. That's military stuff. That's what we see Starfleet doing in Star Trek, therefore Starfleet is a military. Now, having said all of that, let me address a few additional points. First, Starfleet is obviously not perfectly analogous to a real-life military, because even though it does all that military stuff I was just talking about, and even though it fits the description of a military, which I have been articulating at every single point, its primary reasons for existing do appear to be scientific and diplomatic and humanitarian. While real-world militaries do pursue scientific and diplomatic and humanitarian projects, those are nearly always secondary to their defensive and offensive roles. With Starfleet, those priorities are flipped. The defensive and offensive roles are assumed when necessary, But the main thing Starfleet is there to do is seek out new life and new civilizations, etc., etc. Second, if Star Trek were real life instead of an action-adventure pulp sci-fi series, Starfleet would almost certainly be at least two separate organizations. There would be a dedicated military to serve as the armed forces of the Federation, and there would be another agency doing the scientific and exploratory stuff. It doesn't make a ton of sense to have one organization responsible for both of those jobs. But because Star Trek is a work of fiction, and because the creators of the franchise, mainly Gene Roddenberry, drew inspiration from the real-life United States Navy, as well as other works of fiction that centered on military heroes like C.S. Forester's Adventures of Captain Horatio Hornblower, we get Starfleet, the all-in-one space agency, your one-stop shop for anything you need in outer space. You want to venture into the unknown regions of the galaxy? We can do that. You want to stop those freaky half-robot people from conquering Earth? We can do that too. We're Starfleet. We do it all. Realistically, it's ridiculous, but dramatically, it makes perfect sense. You create a socially conscious sci-fi adventure show that is mostly about your heroes visiting other planets and getting involved in morality plays with aliens, but inevitably, you're gonna want to touch on issues related to war, because unfortunately, those issues are relevant to your audience. And who are you going to have fight the wars? Are you going to introduce a whole new group of characters serving in a whole different outfit? Or are you going to have the characters you've already established as the protagonists of your show do it? The answer is obvious. You think I've been watching Captain Kirk and Spock this whole time because I want to see Colonel Dick's space gun and the Cosmic Commandos fight the Klingons? I do not. So yeah, is Starfleet actually a military? If you ask me, the answer is yes, though it does also have different priorities and much broader responsibilities than we would expect from a real-life military. But another question to ask might be, why does it matter? And maybe it doesn't matter to you. Maybe you're happy to accept the franchise at face value when it says that Starfleet isn't a military, and you're not particularly persuaded by my arguments here. Maybe you agree with me that Starfleet, as we see it depicted, is a military, but you're just not interested in that. Either way, that's fine. And if either of those describes your position on the matter, thanks for watching this far into the video. Does it affect my opinion of the show as I'm watching it? In all honesty, not really. I'm not sitting there fuming over it the whole time. I'm mostly oblivious to it because it's just part of what Star Trek is. But I do think one of the many reasons why some of my favorite Star Trek projects are the two films directed by Nicholas Meyer, Star Trek II and Star Trek VI, is that Meyer presents Starfleet as a military organization the most explicitly. In Nicholas Meyer's version of Star Trek, there's a higher level of discipline among the crew. We see the formal ceremony when Admiral Kirk comes aboard the Enterprise. We see personnel standing at attention. The Enterprise itself feels more like a submarine, dimmer lighting, tighter quarters. Even the uniforms have more of an official, martial quality. At one point in Star Trek II, an angry David Marcus exclaims to his mother, Carol, that scientists have always been pawns of the military. The military he's referring to is Starfleet. Meyer's militaristic take on Starfleet was a big problem for Gene Roddenberry. Roddenberry objected strenuously, insisting that Starfleet was not a military organization. Star Trek wasn't meant to be a show about armed conflict. It was about exploration and discovery. It was peaceful, even pacifist in nature, which, okay, great idea, Gene, but maybe if that's what you wanted, you shouldn't have made all your heroes officers in the goddamn Space Navy. Meyer's Star Trek films don't lean into the military or not military tension. They step over it by simply admitting what has always been apparent. Starfleet is a military. Nobody in those films pretends that it is anything else. That helps them feel more grounded and realistic, which is important because both Star Trek II and Star Trek VI are pretty serious in tone. And it's also more honest. I don't mind Starfleet being a military organization. Thematically and narratively, there are many advantages to having the intrepid explorers who serve as protagonists of Star Trek shows be members of the military. Sure, my feelings about the real-life military are, well, let's say complicated. let's say negative, but in a complicated way. But that doesn't affect my ability to enjoy the adventures of these imaginary people serving in an imaginary military. Fuck, I really hope none of you are playing a drinking game for this one, because if one of the rules is take a drink every time Steve says military, the person who came up with that drinking game is trying to kill you. Okay? They're not your friend. Anyway, I love Star Trek The Next Generation, but it, out of all the Star Trek shows, is the one that declares most vociferously that Starfleet is not a military, even when we see the characters doing explicitly militaristic shit. In the Season 2 episode Peak Performance, Captain Picard and Commander Riker both register their reluctance to participate in a war games simulation because, as Picard says, Starfleet is not a military organization. Its purpose is exploration. Who's he kidding? And if he really believes that, how much of an oblivious dipshit is he? Captain Picard's supposed to be wise and insightful, and usually he is, and then Roddenberry's got him saying nonsense like this. Picard holds a military rank. He's the commander of a ship with military-style name and registry, carrying enough firepower to wipe out entire cities. There's a Klingon whose whole job is to stand at a control panel and push a button to shoot stuff when Picard tells him to. But Starfleet is not a military organization? I'll buy that Picard doesn't identify strongly with the military aspects of it. That's fine, and that's evident from the portrayal of Picard through the years, but I don't buy for a second that he truly believes Starfleet isn't military. We see that he leans into the militaristic bits when it suits him. In the episode The First Duty, he calls Wesley's lying ass to attention real quick, don't he? And when Worf transfers off the Enterprise to fight in the Klingon Civil War at the end of Season 4, Picard calls the assembled crew to attention in a sign of respect as Worf walks to the transporter room. Seems kind of militarish to me, Jean-Luc, I don't know. Try telling Nog Starfleet's not a military. Or Chief O'Brien. Or Captain Ben Maxwell. Or Dr. Mbenga. Gee, for an organization that's definitely not a military, we sure meet an awful lot of Starfleet people who are traumatized combat veterans. Huh. What about this guy? Burke, who Jake meets during a battle in the war between the Federation and the Klingons that takes place during the 4th and 5th seasons of Deep Space Nine. Does he look like an explorer to you? How'd he get those injuries he died from? Discovering shit? To me, there are two reasons why this topic matters. For one thing, there's a lot of untapped dramatic potential wrapped up in that question of whether or not Starfleet is a military. Most Star Trek characters, and most of the people who have helped to make Star Trek over the last 60 years, including the original creator of the whole thing, insist that Starfleet is not a military organization, and yet the presentation of it on screen shows that it is. There's tension in that contradiction, and if that tension is acknowledged, it could then inform the stories that Star Trek creators tell. And I'm not talking about some pedantic, literalist, one-dimensional, let's come up with an in-universe explanation for why Starfleet seems military but actually isn't that resolves the tension and fixes it bullshit. I'm talking about leaning into the tension, treating it as real, taking it seriously. There's a difference between what Starfleet says it is, what most of the people who serve in it believe it is, and what it actually is. What does that mean? Where can we go with that? Suppose the heroic Starfleet captain lead protagonist of a hypothetical future Star Trek series is forced to confront that tension, to wrestle with the fact that Starfleet isn't what they've always believed it to be, to realize that they signed up to expand knowledge and encourage peaceful coexistence between alien species, but they've actually spent most of their career patrolling borders or enforcing trade agreements or participating in armed conflicts with other galactic nation states. They were recruited with the promise they would be an explorer, but once they joined up, they were put to work as a soldier. That's not a story, that's not even a premise. It's just a place to start, a seed that could be cultivated into a story, but I see potential in it. Star Trek has been around for 60 years now. It's familiar, it's well-trodden ground. It's a dilemma for people who set out to tell new Star Trek stories to do that in a way that is fresh and innovative, but still recognizable as Star Trek. It seems to me one possible way of doing that would be to acknowledge this tension, this contradiction about the nature of Starfleet, and to have a character or a group of characters who start to challenge the company line. Shit, to even admit that it is a company line. I don't know what the story is or where it goes, but that point of departure is intriguing to me. That leads into the other reason why I think, is Starfleet a military, is a question that matters, and that is because how Starfleet is depicted says something about real-life organizations. I know I say this all the time, but Star Trek is only superficially about people living on spaceships in the future. It's not actually about that. It's actually about you and me living on planet Earth in the present. The Federation isn't the Federation. It's the United States. It's Western civilization. It's whatever part of our real world it represents in a given story. Starfleet isn't Starfleet. It's the US military or whatever other organization it represents in a given story, usually the US military. We are living in an era where allegedly non-military government departments at all levels have become more and more militarized. Here in the United States, police departments, even in small or mid-sized cities with relatively low crime rates, are buying armored vehicles. Squads of immigration enforcement agents, equipped and operating like military units, incompetent, poorly trained military units, but nevertheless, are raiding workplaces and schools and have committed murder multiple times on camera in front of the world. The President of the United States has deployed the actual military to the streets of American cities to intimidate those who don't support him. The line between civilian agencies and the military has been blurred, and the view of the military's proper role in society has been skewed. And that being the case, I don't know, when I think about it, it does kind of bother me that a show typically as smart and aware and with its heart in the right place as Star Trek presents us with an obviously military organization which it constantly tells us isn't a military. I don't think it's being done with any malicious or deceptive intent. I think Gene Roddenberry wanted to have it both ways and present characters who worked for a militaristic organization, but who were also more like astronauts than soldiers. Fair enough. But when you tell stories showing that the organization those astronauts work for also patrols the borders and defends the nation and fights the wars, you should be honest with yourself as the storyteller and with the audience about what that is. In the series premiere of Star Trek The Next Generation, Encounter at Farpoint, Q selects the crew of the Enterprise as representatives of humanity and places them on trial, with the fate of the entire human race on the line. At one point, Riker asks what they should do, knowing that Q is watching their every move and judging them. "We do exactly what we would do if Q wasn't watching," Picard says. "If we're going to be damned, let's be damned for what we really are." Not a good episode, but a good approach. A good lesson for any writers out there. If there's a story you want people to see, make sure that's the story you write. And something worth keeping in mind for all of us, whether we're talking about an organization, a company, a country, or just ourselves as individuals. What matters isn't what we tell the world that we are, but what we show the world that we are. In that scene from TNG's The First Duty I referenced earlier, Captain Picard reminds Wesley that his first duty is to the truth. That makes sense morally and ethically, but it's also just plain practical. No matter what we do to obscure it or disguise it, eventually the truth is always what people see. Hey folks, hope you enjoyed this one. I'm going to let you know what the subject of the next Trek Actually video is going to be, but before I do that, I want to give shout-outs to some of my newest Patreon patrons and channel members. First, the new patrons. They are Old Name No Longer Fits 2026. Thanks, Old Name No Longer Fits 2026. David J. Thompson. Thanks, David. Q Rock. Thanks, Q Rock. Smokey McPotts. Thanks, Smokey McPotts. Paul H. Thanks, Paul. Tal Katz. Thanks, Tal. Junk Mail. Thanks, Junk. Ben Allen. Thanks, Ben. X Deminox. Thanks, X Deminox. Josh Mayfield. Thanks, Josh. And now, the new channel members. They are Tal Katz 1289. Thanks, Tal. Michael Patsold 6648. Thanks, Michael. Hasamir Fenring 1262. Thanks, Hasamir. If you want to support this channel, You can do so by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives or clicking the join button to become a member of this channel. All patrons and members get access to exclusive posts that allow you to vote in the polls that determine upcoming Trek Actually topics, and also submit questions ahead of time for my twice monthly Ask Away live streams. If you pledge $5 a month or more on Patreon, or become a member at the $5 a month tier or higher, you get a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. If you'd rather give a one-time gift than a recurring monthly contribution, you're always more than welcome to do that by clicking the thanks button right below the video, or via PayPal or Venmo. The links for those are in the video description. Many thanks. If you like what I do on YouTube, especially the Star Trek related stuff, you should also check out my side projects. The Ensign's Log, the Star Trek themed comedy podcast that I'm on alongside Jason Harding and Amanda Billings, and Trek Reluctantly, the watch-along stream Dana Cole and I do every Wednesday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern on this channel right here. As always, links in the description. Now for next month's Regulation Trek Actually topic, and I admit it, I stacked the deck for this one, sort of. I didn't do anything to influence the result, but since next month marks the return of Star Trek Strange New Worlds for its 4th and penultimate season, I did put up a poll where every one of the options was a Strange New Worlds related topic. So ever so slightly, I gamed the system. The system that I created to choose the topics of videos I make, but whatever. The winning topic is one I've thought about a lot since this current version of Captain Christopher Pike was introduced back in the 2nd season of Star Trek Discovery, and I know it's also one some of you have discussed in the comment sections of several of my videos. I hope I can do it justice in the video. The topic of next month's Trek Actually video will be, is Captain Pike's tragic fate actually a happy ending? Provocative. Are you provoked? That's next month. I'll be back then and a bunch of times before then. So until the next time you see me, whenever that is, thanks for watching and take care, everybody.